Today we're going to be looking at the Reserve Bank of Australia and how they implement monetary policy by the manipulation of the cash rate target. Now, you're already aware that monetary policy is used to manipulate aggregate demand in the Australian economy. That's all it can do. It cannot impact aggregate supply, unlike budgetary policy. The RBA's main goal is to make sure that inflation stays within 2 to 3% headline inflation over the medium term. If it goes below this target, they have to find ways to stimulate the economy via shifting the aggregate demand to the right. While when the economy is overheating and inflation is beyond 3%, they have to find ways to slow down aggregate demand and shift it to the left. And in order to do this, they need to find a way to manipulate the money supply within an economy to bring the cost of borrowing money up or down. Now, as part of the VCE study design, you have to look at the last 2 years' economic data and have that fresh on your mind when you talk about monetary policy. So since 2018, we were sitting at 1.5% cash rate, and we didn't experience a change till June 5, 2019. Let me just zoom in a bit so it makes it a bit easy to see. There we go. So in June 5, 2019, we decided to drop the cash rate by 0.25% to try and stimulate the economy because inflation was low. And we did it again in July because the first round of stimulus wasn't enough to have any significant impact on our economic development. This was again changed back in the 2nd of October. We dropped it again 0.25 to get it down to 0.075%. And then in March, as you know, coronavirus, the bushfires took its toll on the economy, we decided to drop the cash rate by 0.25% to try and stimulate our economy while everything that was happening around the world and even us locally was slowing down. And in an unusual move, which has never been seen, I don't think this even happened during the GFC. Let me just double check. 2009. Nope. Didn't even happen during the GFC. So this is the first time I've ever seen it. I don't know if it's the first time in history, but the RBA went against its normal rule of the first Tuesday of every month, deciding what they're going to do with the cash rate, to doing it towards mid-March. That tells you the scale of the economic problem we're facing with COVID-19. So they decided to drop it another 0.25%, bringing our cash rate to its existing point of 0.25%. So if we look at trading economics inflation Australia, load up the data here. You can see in the last couple of years, we have not reached our target of 2 to 3% inflation very well. I mean, we had one quarter where we hit it and another quarter in the last 3 years. All right. The last time we actually had a consistent target within 2 to 3% was back around 2013 and 14. And once the mining boom ended, we pretty much just went downhill, and we haven't been able to recover it ever since. We've been struggling to get inflation on target, and I'm pretty sure our GDP figures show the same sort of deal. Let's see, annual growth rate. Even our GDP figures have struggled to stay within 3 to 3.5% during that time frame. Like, that's 3.5. That's what we believe is sustainable. We've hit it only a couple of times in the last 8 years or 6 years. So from 2013 onwards, we didn't really hit the target until about 2016 for one quarter, and then we didn't hit that target again till maybe we had 2 quarters of economic growth where it was within the target range in late 2017, and so maybe the December quarter of 2017 and the March quarter of 2018, and that was it. Ever since then, we've been very sluggish. We've been growing very slow. So yeah, monetary policy hasn't been doing a very good job in the last few years trying to keep inflation within the 2 to 3% target range. So what you're looking at now is literally how the cash market works. The supply of cash is simply controlled by the RBA, and the demand for cash is controlled by commercial banks. So right now the cash rate is currently sitting at 0.25%, And this is what it looks like. Now, why is the supply line vertical? It's a good question, because regardless of what price people are willing to pay for it, they're only willing to supply this much. They have no incentive to supply more when interest rates go up, and they have no incentive to supply less when interest rates go down. Their goal is just to make sure the supply of money stays where it is, because they're trying to keep inflation within 2 to 3% by altering the cash rate. Now, when the RBA decides that they want to change the cash rate either up or down, this is how the system works. They're literally going to find a way to shift the supply either left or right in order to increase the cash rate or decrease the cash rate, as you can see here. Alright, first off, we need to show you how banks and the RBA communicate with each other in order to work demand and supply of cash. So every commercial bank or financial institution has an ESA account. This stands for Exchange Settlement Account, and they use that account to settle their day-to-day transactions. So at the end of any given day, there's 1,000 or maybe 1,000,000 transactions that occur. So they use that time frame pretty much to amalgamate and figure out where all these transactions need to go and send a lump sum money to where it's needed. So sometimes you're going to find out that some banks will have extra funds available in their account, while other banks need to borrow funds in order to cover the transactions that they need to do on that day. And this is due to the nature of how banks operate. Banks do not hold all the savings that you ever provide to them. They lend out a majority of it because they know that not all their customers are going to recall all that money all at the same time. Now, this could be very dangerous, and this is why the GFC had occurred. So in Australia, we have measures in place to make sure there's enough liquidity in the market, there's enough cash flow happening with banks to ensure that they could cover their day-to-day operations of banking and still use the money to earn money off it. Now, those banks that have like a surplus of funds sitting in their account, they're not going to just let it sit there and do nothing for them. They're going to try and find a way to make a profit out of it. So what they can do is give it to the Reserve Bank of Australia and earn 0.25% interest lower than the cash rate on that the amount of funds they have available. So if you have $1 billion, they could earn probably 0.25% interest if the cash rate was at 0.5%, for example. At the moment, the cash rate is sitting at 0.25%. So that means for anyone who has a surplus of funds, when they deposit in the RBA, they actually get nothing in return. So there's no incentive to give this money to the RBA. And we'll talk into what they can do rather than give their cash to the RBA in a moment. Now, with the deficit, same sort of deal. If they've run short on funds, they could go to the Reserve Bank of Australia and borrow additional funds to cover them for their day-to-day transactions. And this comes at a cost of 0.25% higher than the target cash rate. So in this case, the cash rate is currently sitting at 0.25%. If they want to borrow money to cover their day-to-day transactions, they have to pay an extra 0.25% to have the privilege to do so. So it can be quite pricey. Now, the great thing about commercial banks are that they don't actually have to borrow the money from the RBA. They could borrow it from each other. So banks generally will communicate with each other and trade within the cash rate target. Because if you have a surplus of funds, if you can lend it to another bank, you'll earn 0.25% more interest through that transaction. And if you're a borrower of funds from another bank, you could borrow money at 0.25% cheaper than what you can get at the RBA. So banks have an incentive to trade with each other rather than going to the RBA because it's more profitable for both parties involved. So yeah, the RBA is like the worst case scenario, the last resort if they ever need to deposit their surplus funds or borrow money to fund their deficits. So now I'm going to show you how does the RBA actually change the cash rate. So looking at our previous example over here, let's just say they move from 0.5% to 0.25% like they did in 20th of March. Let's put that into our little diagram on Paint. So here it is. The cash rate is currently at 0.5%. So we got to find a way to shift shift the cash rate down. So how are we going to get it down? So since it's the RBA trying to manipulate the cash rate, that means we can only play around with the supply curve in order to get this cash rate to the target rate that we want. In this case, we want the target rate to be 0.25%. So how are we going to make the equilibrium price get to that point by moving supply? We would either go left or right. Hopefully you guys have said that we go right, because that is absolutely correct. Because if we draw up a new supply line like so, and call this one S2, okay, this is going to look really stupid, but whatever. Let's do this at size 15, because, you know, yellow. Put it here. So this is our new S curve, so we'll just put supply 2. Hey, it looks like a love heart. Alright, S2. We're going to find that with the new supply line, we'll go away from this point here. We'll just call this point A. We are now going to be at point B. Whoops. What have I done? Whoop. B. At point B, we're going to realize that there's an increased quantity of cash, and the price of cash is a lot lower. In this case, it's 0.25% lower, which brings us to our new point of 0.25%. So how do we get to 0.25%? The RBA doesn't just magically make money available and then be done and dusted with it. So the RBA does this thing through open market operations. Now we know that banks are driven by profit, and banks do not really want to rely on the RBA to settle their exchange settlements accounts at any given day. They'd rather borrow through other banks in order to get this done, because it's more cheaper to borrow money this way. It's also more profitable to lend out money this way. So in order to increase the money supply, the RBA needs to find a way to get more cash into the banks. How are they going to do it when they're only driven up by profits? Well, if you guys are pretty smart and understand how money works, you realize that the RBA needs to make an offer that is too good to refuse by the banks. So to entice banks to obtain more money in their ESA accounts, the RBA needs to provide an offer, or an interest offer, that is too good to refuse. And we already said that before. So what we say by too good to refuse, they need to give them an interest rate offer that provides more cash to them than through interbank trading. So in this case, they need to make sure that they offer them a percentage return that is greater than the 0.25 they get through their current means. Alright, so how are they going to do this? Let's put in green so you can see how we get to this process. So to get more money into the bank accounts of banks, the RBA will try to, so the RBA will buy, and I'll put that in red, and we'll underline it also, will buy any bonds, oh god, this is still underlined, or repo agreements that banks currently have, and give them more money than they would normally get through normal trade. So they make you an offer that's too good to refuse. So in this case, what ends up happening is the the banks will forfeit their bonds or repos, and in return will have money dumped into their ESA accounts. Alright, dumped is probably a bad word. Let's use some real terms. Deposited. Whoop, let me spell that correctly. Deposited in their ESA accounts. So that's how the supply money goes from its original supply of S1 to S2. The RBA will buy bonds or repo agreements that the banks currently have and give them more money than they would normally get through normal day trade. And voila. Supply shifts to the right. Now there's more money in the actual system, in the actual banking system. So when supply is greater than demand, prices go down. And in this case, the cash rate will go down by 0.25%. And now, as a result, banks have more money available. They can lend it out at a cheaper rate than ever before. And households and businesses can now borrow more money than they ever could before at a lower cost, which will hopefully be used to stimulate the economy. And voila, that's how open market operations causes the cash rate to change. And the RBA does it through these means. So let's just say you want to go the other way. Say the RBA wants to push up the cash rate from its 0.25% up to 0.5%. How are they going to get from point B to point A? Well, we just have to go in the opposite direction. So we know that banks are driven up by profits. The RBA needs to make an offer that's too good to refuse by the banks. That hasn't changed. What has changed is the steps involved. So instead of the RBA buying bonds and repos from banks, they're going to sell repos and bonds. So the RBA will sell. Let's underline that. Bold and underline. Oh, okay, it's not bold. Whatever. Will sell any bonds or repos, repo agreements. So the RBA will sell any bonds or repo agreements to banks at a price which provides a higher return than through day-to-day banking. So what happens then? Well, in this situation, it'll be just the opposite. So banks will forfeit their cash, and in return, they will get bonds or repos, repos, which will provide them a higher return in the future. So in this case, when the banks forfeit their cash, they're actually reducing the amount of money supply that's in the actual economy. So supply of money goes from S2 back to S1. And in turn, we'll see that demand is still the same. So demand will contract till it meets the new equilibrium point over here. And voila, the cash rate is now at 0.5%. But you know, banks are happy with that because they know that they're going to make a lot of money by buying these bonds or repos. More money than they would have got if they had kept the money and just lent it out to customers. So there you go, guys. The RBA manipulates greed in order to manipulate the money supply within the economy. And that's how they stimulate aggregate demand or slow down aggregate demand depending on how inflation's going in our country.